5 minutes still. Is that recording?
I don't know. What? Oh, here it is. Presenter overlay.
We'll try mic mode. Go to that. Is that?
That's
Do we have to
mic.
do? What the heck?
Oh my God. It's kind of
Off.
crazy. Yeah, off.
That's fine.
Here it is.
Oh, okay. And then just share screen again.
Yep, it is recording. All right, and then
Pause, share. Great. Thanks. All right. You ready? Oh, we gotta figure out. Who's gonna say what.
oh my God.
Sorry guys, who has the last
Oh wait, I'll give my camera to Bella.
good, looking good.
It's very powerful.
For you as well.
Oh, is that the old version?
Yeah, isn't it?
Oh, because the acknowledgement of country, I kind of did a few edits.
Yeah, this is the one with your edits, isn't it?
No, I don't think
No, that's the one just on here.
But is that the whole? Did you copy the whole thing off the screen? Here,
Basically, isn't it? I just did like the part that you edited was like just the first part, anyways.
Okay, yeah.
Should be fine.
I have
But,
it here anyways.
what should we do? Why don't we
I haven't done.
I mean I've say welcome, I do it, and then you want to do the acknowledgement of
Yeah.
country? Yeah. Boy, Roman. And then Gastrodiplomacy. What do you want to do? You want to do that? Oh, hi, Alex. Oh, hey, Ken. Thanks for coming.
Hi, John. How are you?
All right. Well, I'm gonna draw this. Yeah, sure. Put it back. We can put it back here if you like. Okay. Should we like split up like what is gastrodiplomacy? So, like what is SUG and what is gastrodiplomacy?
Yeah, I reckon.
So, what do you want to do?
I have no preference, honestly.
Okay. Well, I'll do the first one just to keep in order. We can do the next one. Gastrodiplomacy as a Roman. Then, yeah, well, I'll just say the agenda.
You can do the agenda.
Blah blah, and then we can introduce that. How do we do that?
What is this?
This is just like introducing, like just say like, oh, like without further ado,
Okay.
here's our panelists, and then like
Wait. I'm just scared that I'm gonna forget stuff.
it's up,
Everything's there. Okay, good.
and we're gonna have it on the screen anyway. So
Oh yeah.
like that. So just like pass it to them, and then say like basically.
So I'll just like present like one give them the mic, or do I present all of them and then give the mic to the first one?
It's just like present them all at once. So just say,
Yeah, yeah.
without further ado, there's the panelists.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then just don't really go into the background. I think it's too
Yeah.
much. Just say like, yeah. So like, what are you, what like your research or like what are you doing, or just like area
No,
of interest.
I don't. No, I don't say that. I ask them.
Yeah. Basically, you're saying like, no, so you're basically saying, without further ado, there's a panelist. Can you just tell us briefly about what your area of interest is, what kind of research you're doing, and why you're motivated, why you.
So here are the panelists. Name the panelists, and then say, "Can you?" Or do I don't even name them? I just say, "Oh, panelists," and then yeah, can
You need
maybe
to name them. You can probably just start like this.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess
good idea.
Juliet will be sitting here. So
And Mike?
we have these two. And we have
have
this.
We don't have.
I don't think we have snapping.
Yeah,
That's a bit
okay,
bad.
that's okay.
I don't know, but it's a pretty small room, so I don't think we'll need it
Oh, yeah, but we do need it for the Zoom.
for the Zoom. Oh, it's fine.
Well, the Zoom was it's basically useless then.
Yeah.
Or
Only
maybe we put them there. We put them like here. And so.
should we?
Get heard by the Zoom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how should we do this? Should I just put the Zoom over there and then you can log on to your laptop to do the presentation?
No, I'm saying the mics. If we put the mics here,
Oh, yeah.
then the mics feed into the Zoom, right? Oh,
Yeah.
Can we try? Leo's here.
Okay, it is 5.
Yeah.
Just waiting on
Hello?
Juliet.
Oh, this is not there. 1, 2. This is not.
Hello. I think he's gonna be on Zoom anyway. It's just one person.
And then. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll try the other one.
If it's not, we'll just like hit the recording and then like make the sound super loud and post and then just post it.
I've tried this a bunch of times.
Really?
If the Zoom, if you can't read stuff on it, but yeah, we'll say. Maybe it's because the. Let's try this. When do we have to start?
Just whenever Juliet gets here.
Okay. What else do we have to?
Okay. What do you want to do? Should we just do like half on each one?
Yeah. What are we supposed to do?
Roughly. We'll just kind of say like introduce the topic and say like, oh, because they all have the colors, right? So it's just like,
Yeah.
oh, like we know like, let's say Dr. Cross, her research had this. What do we think about? And then we'll just talk about maybe like, oh, indigenous land and food knowledge, blah blah blah. Like this first one is kind of, it's better if we say like, oh, speaking of like the knowledge of the country,
Yeah,
blah, blah, but then like these ones are kind of connected, so we can just do that. I think it should be fine.
Yeah, we'll wing it. Yeah, we'll wing it. Sorry. And then that's it, right? Basically,
Maybe a
just
little more. Yeah.
finish this. Then do you want to do the pre-networking template?
The heck? You should know this one. This one. There we go. Okay. Yeah, and then the last part, just same, I guess. I'll just do a little bit of that. Climate change. And then networking time, yeah. And then we'll just have everyone kind of,
Yeah.
channel out.
We have like a different
Color is a bit weird, isn't it?
colors fine. We just need. I haven't taken my laptop. I don't think. But it's fine. Instead of mirroring, we could do one thing here so that we can have the chat here if there are any questions in chat.
I don't think there'll be a chat.
Okay.
If there's a chat, we'll just put it like, just put it.
I think we close the chat and we just open it when
Oh, when
people have
there is a
questions.
chat.
Yeah. Because we'll see when there's a chat thing.
Huh? What's that? We just- People on the Zoom. Leo is on the Zoom.
It'll be fine. We're not gonna use the mics, I guess, because it's a small room. And we can't make them work. I don't know why it's not working, but let's see just here.
Everything's set up outside.
Cool.
Thanks.
You can, oh my God, that is kind of cool.
Hmm.
You can
Oh,
enter from your
should we do that?
iPhone, but your battery's gonna die, right?
I mean, I have
Oh yeah, we can try.
49%.
And I have it's a lightning, right? I have a power bank. Maybe let's do that. Let's.
Oh, that's cool. Hello. Hello. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello, yeah.
And we just put it like in front there so that. Taking this and there's power outlets on the tables.
Or not on that, you know. Alright, and then I'll just put that there.
The sound comes in from here. Oh, wonderful. Great.
Inside it's coming down and she's looking at care classes. Yeah, and your friends are but they.
I know. They are.
And the girl was in bed look.
And then like, and that's the other thing about this bigger chicken. I get coached. So I couldn't put my money there. So I didn't want to. That was very cheap. But she. Are you kind of.
Maybe and obviously we went to like and there's my best friend to go now counting now we was there like thinking did I she's like she that whole haunted house
Oh, down.
And I went in.
Why don't Neil's team? Not kind of great space.
It was like.
And wait and see.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
Working with Peter Ray and yesterday, last week. No, I'm going.
Oh, so I must have got.
All righty, hello, everybody. Hope you're having a good day despite the rain. Thank you so much for coming. Very nice to see all these new faces. Yeah, so welcome. This is the future of global food culture academic panel discussion, and yeah, we'll just get right into it. So yeah, before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that this discussion is going to take place on Gadigal country, and we wish to pay our respects to elders past and present, and recognize that on this land, for thousands of years, knowledge has been created and shared, and that sovereignty has never been ceded. And that phrase is often used as a sort of stock expression thrown around, but we really mean that what that means is that Gadigal people have an enduring connection with this land. And yeah, as you'll hear about today, we're going to talk about Indigenous foods. And you'll see that there is a lot that we can still learn from Indigenous ways of seeing the world. And yeah, as we talk about global food culture, we'd like to keep that in mind.
Yeah, beautiful. So yeah, we are the Sydney Uni Gastrodiplomacy Society, and just to keep it short, what we do is we do little dinner parties, events, networking, all of that. The first picture, that's from the U.S. consulate. We had a little pie making competition, which was fun, and that is from our recent dinner party, which we did about sustainability and incorporating that in fine dining. That was a lot of fun, and yeah, a lot of familiar faces here today, so that's very good.
And so before we start our panel, maybe for those who are new to the society and don't know what the gastrodiplomacy is, so it's the intersection between food and public diplomacy. And often in the academic side of things, it's really thought of as an international relations sort of discipline where you look at food as a tool for relations between states. But here in this panel, we have kind of expanded that into global food culture, so that we can include things that aren't, strictly speaking, international relations, but pertain to global challenges. So climate change, war, in their whole.
Yeah, gastrodiplomacy, it's not just a political concept. If you're fast, we really love like interdisciplinary stuff, and so we just really wanted to show how you can really incorporate a lot of topics into ideas of like gastrodiplomacy and critically examining food. Yeah, so
yeah, without further ado, please welcome our four panelists for today. Please, everyone. Yeah, and we're just maybe going to start with if you could each say kind of your background research, what's your background research and what you're interested in your research. And maybe we'll start with yeah.
Should we have microphones? It's also might be able to hear it on the.
So we have
we do have
this is like a microphone connected to the Zoom, so that should be enough. If it's too hard to speak loud enough, you can try connecting. Oh, we can put cameras. Yeah.
Hi everyone. So I'm Juliette Bennett, and I'm working at the moment in FAS with the Sydney Centre for Healthy Societies and also with Charles Perkins Centre. which is an interdisciplinary institute, multidisciplinary institute to be in the University of Sydney. And my background was actually first in business. And then I went out into the world and came back and did a Master of Peace and Conflict Studies, followed by something called an MPhil in Peace and Conflict Studies, and then a PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies. And what I loved about this very also interdisciplinary field is I was able to be guided by my interest in particular questions about the world. Originally, it was actually quite related to religion and education, and then it moved into really sort of something called structural violence, which is the indirect forms of violence that leads to a lot of different harms. I'm getting some nods, so it might be familiar, which is great. And I was really interested in things like poverty and sort of the global ecological crisis, and how our small everyday habits unfold to sort of have these big consequences, and how the different economic and political and education and cultural structures mediate that. And then I landed in a postdoc with the people who I just described, and mainly in the Sydney Centre for Healthy Societies, Charles Perkins Centre, looking at something called the social life of food and nourishment. And what's really interesting is, for me, how food invites us to, I think, perhaps intervene, both understand and intervene in these structural forms of violence, because food is something that connects us to each other, connects us to nature, connects so many different parts of our economy. And I think it sort of opens a way to rethink the future and how we think about the future. A little bit.
Very good. Yeah, thanks. Julia, yeah, I'm Tom Roberts, and I'm also here at Sydney Uni in the Faculty of Science, which has many schools. And the one I'm in is the School of Life and Environmental Sciences, one of the biggest schools in the university. And yeah, so I did an agricultural science degree here a long time ago. And even though I was from the city, I then did a PhD in plant biochemistry. So the science of an aspect of biochemistry in plants, like nitrogen metabolism. So very like focused science. And then I went overseas doing postdocs, which means jobs you can get if you're lucky after you've done a PhD. So I went to Lund University in Sweden, and I went to the Rigsø National Laboratory in Denmark, and the Danish Technical University. And I worked at CSIRO back here in Sydney. And then eventually, yeah, 10 years after I got my PhD, that shows you how hard it is to get a job sometimes. Eventually, I got a ongoing lectureship at Macquarie University, first in biological sciences, and then in a chemistry, more like a chemistry department. And then in 2011, 2012, I moved here. And I had done research up until that point, pretty much only in plant biochemistry, a little bit of food applications, but mostly about plants. And I worked on many different species. And then I came here and got a job like as a food chemist, but with my plant biochemistry background. So I teach in the food science major, the more molecular aspects of that. And I'm the coordinator of the major and the degree coordinator for the degree that's called food and agribusiness and things like that. But since that time, since I came here, I've been mostly focused on cereals. So I work on rice and sorghum and wheat and barley. And I've had many different projects. So I'll only talk about maybe two of them right now. So one of them concerns sorghum, which is Australia's biggest summer crop. You know how we have wheat, which is a winter crop, for example, in Australia, and then we have summer crops like cotton. Well, sorghum is a huge crop, but most people don't know much about it because almost all the sorghum grain goes to feed animals. So the research I've been doing is to try to develop foods that Western palates would like based on sorghum grain. And then the other project that Beck and I can talk about, because we're collaborating on it, concerns Australian native grains, so Indigenous grains. So these are, grains from Australian native grasses that our Indigenous friends and colleagues have been, involved with for literally tens of thousands of years. And luckily we have people who still have, depths of knowledge in that area, and we collaborate with them. So we have a grant together on that. So thanks for your time. Yeah.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Rebecca Cross. Did any of you, are you in my classes at all? No. Oh.
You should have recognized that person, surely.
I know, I'm sorry. So I'm in the School of Geosciences and Faculty of Science. I mean, a bit of my pathway was really looking at my family's farming practices and really wanting to protect that environment. And so choosing environmental science and then being like, hold on, the way people make decisions isn't logical to science. So then I really wanted to study people's attitudes and behaviors and how that resulted in land management practices. And so I did my PhD looking at regenerative agriculture and regenerative ag transitions. So everything from practices to the emotional transitions, the mental, intellectual transitions, psychological transitions, economic transitions, all aspects of transition to understand how different people are doing this in different places. And then from there, I've done a lot of other projects looking at those transitions, the advent of carbon farming in Australia and how that's hit the ground and what that actually means for landholders, as well as other projects like a current one on horticulture, looking at the expansion of different types of horticulture and what types of opportunities and tensions that's creating in local places. So yes, I'm a human geographer, but I'm more of a rural and environmental geographer. And so, yes, my work has definitely moved into looking more at Indigenous transitions, which you can say are really revitalizations of knowledge, of sleeping knowledge, and how to promote specifically the use of native grasses, both in regenerative agriculture for grazing, in terms of ecology, for harvesting seed and regenerating landscapes, and then also as a grain for consumption as well. So very focused on how do we transition towards that in Australia and what does that look like? Thanks, Jonathan.
And now for something completely different. Hello, I'm John Mickler, and I'm in the department, no, it's a discipline now, of Government and International Relations in the School of Social and Political Sciences in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Most of my research is about capitalism and corporate power. So I've got a book called The Political Power of Global Corporations, another one on liberal capitalism, but substantively, most of my research has been on climate change and environmental matters. And that comes from sort of like something that's very personal to me. I'm an ocean swimmer, I'm a bushwalker, I love the natural environment, and it upsets me greatly the way in which we're using it up. And I'm worried about what the reasons for that are. So my angle into this is, I guess, comparative and international political economy. In terms of background, before these books, and I've written about also about climate change in the car industry. Anyway, lots about the environment, climate change from a political economy point of view. But if you go all the way back to when I was at university, I was doing an economics degree, and I've been recovering from it ever since. And I did it because I come from a pretty much a working class background. No one in my family had been to university before. And I was really interested about this idea that like people who were very well off and comfortable with the idea of going to university, whose parents had professional jobs and this kind of thing. People who had a lot of money, people who didn't have a lot of money, where does the money come from and who gets it and how do they get it? How does the economy work? Well, I found by the time I was going into second and third year of my studies, that wasn't what economics was about at all. It became a lot of mathematics. What's this got to do with anything? But then I was very lucky one semester. Do you know how it is? You think you've got all these options for electives, and then you find that you don't. And I was in my sort of like third year and like thinking about doing honours in the fourth year, which I did do. And I found the only choices that worked with my timetable was something called linear programming. I still don't know what that is. I'm glad I didn't find out what it was because it sounds awful. And the other one was natural and environmental resources economics. And I thought, oh, do you know, it's going to be about how do we most efficiently chop the trees down and use them in a sustainable manner, this kind of thing. But it wasn't. I met this wonderfully subversive lecturer named Jeff Waugh, and I just absolutely loved him. He would say things like, in the exam, the correct answer to this question is, and he'd tell you what it was, which of course is wrong. But that's the answer you have to give. Because really the correct answer is, and he would do this kind of thing all the time. So I loved him. So when I came to do honours, I just went to him and I said, I want you to be my supervisor. I'm interested in the environment. And he said, that's great. Why don't you look at southern bluefin tuna? And that's what I did my thesis on. So I've been on a journey ever since then, looking at environmental matters, questions of sustainability, climate change, fisheries, that kind of thing. And here I am today writing about corporations and capitalism too. There's other things in between, but I think I've talked for long enough. You get the idea, you go on a journey. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, John did mention how everyone is quite different, but somehow through this panel, you'll see how everything is all connected. So, yeah, just moving right on. I think we can start with Beck has some really interesting research and class about Indigenous land and food knowledge. And just because we talked a little bit about the acknowledgement of country, why that matters, and what we can learn through Indigenous knowledge, why don't we just have Beck start us off by telling us what do you do with Indigenous knowledge? What kind of what have you been doing?
Yeah, I mean, it links into native grains, and I know you've got native grains a bit further down, but I think it's okay to bookend this whole conversation with native grains. So really, that's where my journey started. But I was also really passionate about how do we teach at university and how do we break down certain paradigms, certain elitisms in, epistemology. So, what knowledges do we see as fact and what knowledges do we completely ignore or dismiss? So went on my own sort of cultural competence journey, still on it, never finishes, to really unpack, how this was happening in land management and agriculture specifically. So the native grains was part of that, but I sort of used teaching as a tool to teach myself, which is kind of, I think, why people end up staying in academia, to just become the perennial learner. Every time we have to create a lecture for you, we get to go and do all this research and then pack it and deliver it in. So I decided to with some colleagues, to develop a unit of study. So the university wanted us to indigenize curriculum. Some people like that term. Some people find it quite jarring to make that term into a verb as such. Some would say decolonize. Again, that's fraught as well in all its own ways. But to do that, we decided, okay, we don't have any knowledge. How do we create a unit where we're just facilitators and we take people out into communities and learn from the experts? So Indigenous elders, Indigenous enterprises, Indigenous organisations. So we created this unit of study, and actually it's open to anyone. And if you do Indigenous studies, it's a selective in your degree. But we go for 14 days. And we go across multiple countries, and we spend good quality time with elders that really start to unpack maybe some of the ways that we've been programmed to think through mainstream education, and to really understand Indigenous land management, but how that links in not just to culture, but spirituality as well. And I think that that's a big thing that we often leave out of understanding Indigenous knowledges. It's like, oh, this bit fits into my worldview or my reference points, but all of that stuff, I'll just ignore that, rather than seeing that actually all of that is really interconnected. And so this unit of study was to really help students that wanted to develop their cultural competency, wanted to generate relationships with communities and elders, to get out there. And we do 14 days because there's so much to take on and process, and you need time to process, and we have lots and lots of discussions in between, and it's helped people feel confident to then step into doing honours in Indigenous spaces, for looking for jobs in Indigenous organisations, or in government organisations that advocate for Indigenous people, like Indigenous Business Australia. So I guess that's really where that came from. But in terms of Indigenous land management, the sort of things that we learn about, so we definitely go up to Narrabri, where our native grains work is based. Sydney Uni has a bunch of farms. I don't know if you guys know about that. I don't know if you know what we do on those farms. You should investigate, because it's not okay. Especially when Sydney touts to be number 7 in sustainability. I don't know how. But on some of those farms, on that farm in particular, on Gamilaroi country, is where we have a native grains plot, and we've started doing native grains work. So there's lots of different aspects of that work, and that's where we take students as part of that, so they can be part of that work, learn about different aspects like cultural burning and how that regenerates grasslands, which grasses are best to eat, how to thresh those grasses, how easy it is to get the seed out of the coats, what sort of products you can make, but beyond that, to understand Indigenous food sovereignty. And so a lot of people have sort of come into native grains going, oh, why don't we just get all these farmers on board? You know, let's get this big funding. Let's create this industry. And in so many native foods industries, if you think about it in Australia, if you know some of the stats, it's like 2%, maybe 3% now of the profit actually lands and hits the ground and goes back to Indigenous communities. So there's been huge exploitation of Indigenous knowledges to make certain products, even products that you might use every day and have no idea. What is the one that the German company makes that helps spasmodal? Oh, starts with B. Well, it's a big one. Anyway, it actually is based on Australian Indigenous knowledges and wisdom, and it's a multi-million-dollar sort of enterprise. Oh yeah. So, and this is really common throughout the world. It's called biopiracy, where scouts are sent in to get Indigenous knowledges and then to patent certain processes and to make products out of that and money. So our fear in native grains, or not fear, but our wishes, is that as this develops, it's about Indigenous people having power to guide where this market goes, how it gets developed, how people are involved. So just going straight to farmers and doing that sort of thing, you just run the risk of, I guess, the toothpaste just being let out of the tube and not actually being able to instill this as being an Indigenous-led industry. And so that's a lot of what we talk about on the field trip as well. Sorry, I've talked too long. I'll stop.
Just to say that if you have questions, this is kind of an interactive panel. So if you have questions, please raise your hands. We're just there to we don't want to be asking the questions. We want you to ask the questions. But maybe going off of what you're saying, that's really fascinating. And I think both Thomas Roberts, you've done work on Indigenous grains, so maybe you can talk about your research. But I think even John, I know in one of our classes talked about the medical corporations and how that sort of talk about the patents and taking those resources. Maybe that even could be fit with what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this case, I'm not an expert on grains or anything like that, but yeah, there's a sort of pattern of things that come out of the environment that are patented and then are owned, and they're not exploited. People like to say on a market basis, but it's not on a market basis. It's on the basis of ownership and control of whatever the product is or the production process that comes out of it. And then the companies can charge whatever they want for it, controlling it and owning it. And it doesn't just go for grains, but in all sorts of other ways. An awful lot of basic research, majority, well, it depends on the country, but we can say a lot is funded by and often done by the public sector and public institutions with public money. And then when there's something that a large corporation can make a lot of money out of, they patent it or copyright it, and then they're allowed to sort of like lock out competitors, usually on average for about 20 years. There's nothing very liberal or free market about that. It's all about industry and corporate control. In other words, to make sure there's no competition and to make sure that basically things that were in the public domain are now privately exploited by very powerful organizations.
Okay, and Dr. Roberts.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard balance to come to sometimes, isn't it? So, for example, a drug company might see a potential market for a drug that might prevent or help cure a particular illness, and they might start working on that, not using any natural products at all, so they don't belong to anyone in the world. They might just take an enzyme that's partly responsible for this disease metabolically, start with that protein, look at the structure, screen 1 million different compounds that they've synthesized in their lab. And by the time if they find one or two that are really good, it will cost them about $1 billion before they can get regulatory approval to sell that drug. So that's a huge investment and they have to be able to get it back. But on the other hand, if a company is coming to Australia, talking to Aboriginal people and finding out that the leaf of this species contains a compound or can, when mushed up, made into a syrup or something, can cure a disease, and then they kind of take that leaf without any permission from the Indigenous people. They take that back to Germany or wherever and do a series of purifications and find out that this particular compound, yes, does cure that disease or help with people's symptoms, then that's a whole different thing. So there's everything from amazing ingenuity and research that has, does no harm to anyone in terms of the original ownership. And then there's basically stealing. There's a whole range of different things, from my perspective anyway, of these big companies. Like there are lots of drugs, like say the drugs that people take now if they have HIV. Like if you look at the research that went into that was incredible. And we can't do without those drugs. I mean, people who have HIV now can have a lifespan just as long as anyone else, pretty much, because of the amazing research that those huge companies did. But yeah,
sometimes, but not always.
Of course, that's it.
I remember
every case is different.
I think AZT, one of the original AIDS drugs, was actually the patent was owned by, I think it was GlaxoSmithKline or GlaxoSmithKline Beecham, whatever they were called then.
Yeah.
And it was patented as a drug for pets, for dogs, from memory. It had some other kind of efficacy, some other kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then they realized, oh, hang on, we've got this patent. And it actually can be used for HIV.
Yeah, right.
So they rolled it out as that, they got the patent, and then they charged an absolute fortune. And they tried to stop anyone from making generics, and especially in developing countries, a lot of people died because they used the agreements in the World Trade Organization with the backing of their governments to make sure that those people couldn't get those drugs because they wanted to charge a very high price for them. Vandana Shiva wrote a lot about that about 20 years or so ago, and it was absolutely heinous what they did. But in other circumstances, yes, if they're doing the research, fair enough, but not always.
I just thought of the medication of Buscopan. Next time you take Buscopan, yes, that has Indigenous knowledge. Yeah.
Moving on from medication to similar concept, food. But would you say like those kind of concepts kind of apply to food as well? Because clearly like you have a lot of research going into nutrition, and there's probably a lot of Indigenous knowledge that goes into that. But once you kind of, I guess, bring that to the market, I'm sure there's some sort of change. So yeah, maybe if anyone has any knowledge on that, we could
Talk about it briefly, and then I'll pass to Julia. I know that's very interesting. But if you think about the whole superfoods realm, and I don't know if you guys know about the chia example, and that being plant bred in a certain way and sort of taking over the market and then suddenly locking out local people who were supplying that market because they can't hit those economies of scale. So that's where the problem lies, is when you upscale, suddenly the types of players that can come in are particular types of players, and then they can lock out local people whose livelihood and knowledge and culture and identity is embedded in that. And in Australia, if you think about certain food products that you have that say that they're about native foods, there's a lot of kettle chips at the moment that have like finger lime and other things. Part of ethical consumerism might be to question where are you giving back to Indigenous communities? How ethical actually are these food products beyond their bad nutrition and that side of it? There's a power thing in there that is commonly sort of smooshed over by most companies using native food products. And you only need to look at our fine dining to really understand how that happens. So with Indigenous foods, it's really interesting in Australia. It's part of the colonial mindset, right? But for so long, Indigenous foods were inferiorized, seen as, like pigweed, for example, purslane or damu in the Gamilaroi language, which when you look at the seeds, it actually has huge concentrations of omega-3. But it was called pigweed. Doesn't just exist in Australia too. You've probably seen it growing in cracks around Sydney, actually. But in Australia, yeah, we call it pigweed. Like, it's good for the pigs to eat. It's low food. That inferiorization, like a grain that we work on called native millet, also known as gully in Gamilaroi. By the local farmers, it's seen as an agricultural weed, something that they spray out of their fields. And it's a panicum, which like they kind of separate here and then the seed heads blow around to disperse seed. So it's often called blowaway grass as well. And so farmers are like, why are they working with that blowaway grass? That's a pest that's got no value at all. So there's that real inferiorization. I remember reading once about a person in the 1950s eating native bread, Indigenous bread, and they said it's an evil, dark-looking substance that was very nutritious. So they had to say that it was evil and dark first before sort of pointing out the virtues of that food. So we have that level, and then you have the opposite of that. And this is like the full dissonance, is that you have this exoticization or fetishization of Indigenous foods, where suddenly people are spending 300 or 400 to have a quiet night by candlelight, eating a wonderful damu salad, the same pigweed that is inferiorized here, but suddenly sort of glorified here. And the people that run those top-end restaurants are largely non-Indigenous, and that profit is being made largely in non-Indigenous spaces. And the people that can access those foods are largely non-Indigenous and have
What is a
family payback? I didn't know there were but yes, so and that's part of where that problem lies when you start looking at our food systems and how we are disrespecting and stealing Indigenous food knowledges. And it's important to think about in that way of stealing, because, and this is where for native grains, there's a lot of ships moving at once. When you think about people that can make the most out of an industry, if it came about, it's people that own land. It's people that have the means to start producing at mass scale. It's people that also understand or can use the legal system. So we also have Indigenous cultural intellectual property, but it doesn't yet fit into a legal system definition. And I think those dichotomies between Indigenous ways of knowing and doing and the systems, the colonial systems that sort of sit upon those, there's this constant dichotomy between them. You know, like if you look at Western sovereignty, it's about ownership and control. If you look at Indigenous sovereignty, it's about respect and obligation to ancestors and country. So, talk too long.
Julia?
Mm.
There's just been so much said, and I'm sort of identifying it, and I guess I've got more questions than contributions. There was something that I was reading recently which sort of looked at some of the feedback loops, and I guess the kind of systems thinking and apply the sort of mapping of different systems and the different parts of systems that then feedback on themselves and in different ways. And I think sort of in the more physical one, it was sort of looking at how one cycle with sort of corporate political activity and the concentration of power and those economies of scale sort of keeps replicating a particular mode of being. George Monbiot, writer for The Guardian, talks about the global standard diet, which reinforces the global, is reinforced by the global standard farm, and that there's a cycle between them, and that cycle seems to be spreading. And a paper we wrote on ultra processed food was sort of one, the most recent kind of like a food regime that's been called in sort of world systems theory terms, and that sort of standardization and that extraction of nutrients has its way. And then on the other side, you've got alternative approaches to nutrition and alternative ways of doing agriculture, agroecology, and they sort of can actually self-reinforce. And so you have participatory approaches, you have food sovereignty that so up on and so you have these two models, and I guess they sit at the moment replicating and reinforcing each other. And I'm very interested in how, like, I don't know when I'm listening to you sort of between the, you know, the fetishization and the sort of devaluing of Indigenous food, would the middle ground then be still a kind of co-opting? Or because the Indigenous way just seems so different. And I guess in the context of climate change and all the problems, there's an aspect that there's a needing to get rid of the industrial corporate model, almost get rid of it in total and like have this alternative. Well, of course, pragmatically, we need to feed the world, we need, you know, so there's this, you know, really big picture, there's this planned transition that needs to unfold. But you know, when you think about these grains that you're studying and the potential for that to be locally owned, locally grown, grows easily, like, you know, is there a way that can I don't know, slowly and submissively eat away at global capitalism, then suddenly that problematic system is obsolete. That's the hope. That's the tricky one.
It is the hope, yes, because I mean, and that's that bit where other companies or others have come in and been like, oh, native grains, let's plant breed them, let's make them bigger, let's standardize that, which we know takes nutrition out, which takes that diversity out of foods. Like when we look at native grains, they grow differently in different places. And part of that diversity is what then you take in, and it creates your diversity. So there's a lot around like gastrocolonialism. And the fact that we've internalized literally colonialism based on these standard limited suite of foods that is part of the globalization, you know. And so I get really excited by, you know, well, what is the potential for food forests and just super food rich environments? And maybe they're underpinned by native foods, but you could put some other foods in there. I'm not a purist, you know, but how much can we grow off 1 acre of land? We haven't really tested that, and we don't really know, and every bit of land is different. So it could be really exciting. The thing is then, if you are setting up your livelihood on that, how do you then access all the different markets for those different foods? farmers that do that end up spending their whole weekend at farmers markets, and then they're working ridiculous hours to try and have this local food ethos, but that's massively hard. And you're quite vulnerable to certain, events happening like COVID happening, and then there are no more farmers markets. So what do you do with all this locally produced food, and how do you get it out there? It's much easier to go into a standardized model, grow one thing, grow it in a very linear, controlled, simplified manner. You have more surety in that, but you're creating all these other indirect problems for society and environment.
I think there was a question from the
My question is kind of long, but I was sort of wondering, like, do you think like food grown in Australia could potentially include like food grown in a lab? What impact do you think that would have on Indigenous culture and like identity, which is centered in food? Like, what kind of impact do you think would have on ethical consumers if we were mass producing food in the lab? And how can you compare that to climate change? And potentially, with the increasing urbanization of the world, right, we're getting less space to grow food. So, and what the climate change is going to impact our ability to grow food. So do you think, if you compare that to lab grown food, do you think, is that where we're heading? Sorry, that was really
Yeah. So lab grown food, you have this cellular agriculture idea, so you can take cells and grow them in a massive bioreactor, a massive stirred tank, and you can get those cells to eventually form a meat or form leather. It doesn't have to be a food, form all sorts of different products that were traditionally used or produced through agriculture. And like the reason why this is even beginning now, because it really only is just beginning, is because of all the billions and billions of dollars that have been put into medical research, like for cancer, for example, like all that stem cell knowledge you need to have to produce the cells that you then grow and reproduce. And all of the knowledge from the food industry about keeping huge vessels sterile. So like if you made cellular meat, through culturing muscle cells, all the meat would be completely sterile. So it would have a very long shelf life and be extremely safe, for example. So there are some advantages. And then, do these technologies have the advantage of less water, less greenhouse gases, less land? Do they have all these environmental advantages or not? So potentially they do, but there's still some technological hurdles that have to be jumped before it's going to be possible to grow any of this food at big scale. For example, the number of head of cattle in Australia is enormous. However many you think there are, there's probably 10 times more, 100 times more. We produce a lot of beef and we export a lot of it. So when people try to make a calculation on how many bioreactors of a certain size, like each one might be half as big as this room or something, how many of those we would need to make that amount of food, it's massive. Even though, okay, I'll just diverge for a second. So if you take a steer and you slaughter it, so you allow the steer to graze for a couple of years, or you take it to a feedlot, it's only a bit over half of the carcass that is usable as food anyway. You lose the head, you lose the blood, you lose most of the organs, we don't eat them. And then the money that comes from the sale of that steer is really only the choice cuts, really. That's where the farmer and the butcher and everyone will make their money. So there's not that much food on a steer compared to the resources that those cattle are using, right? The land and their water and all the methane emissions and everything. It's very little food and it's very inefficient in many ways. But still, the total amount of, just say meat for a moment, that we make in Australia, we make 700 million broilers, like, chickens for meat in Australia every year, 700 million. So that's about one chicken per week per person. That's how much chicken we eat in Australia, right? So to replicate that, like to have any dent on it whatsoever with cellular agriculture, my thinking is going to be 40 years. I just can't see it happening. And I'm actually collaborating with a company down at UTS who is trying to develop aspects of cellular agriculture. But, you know, they have venture capital from Singapore, and I think what they're doing is good and potentially very sustainable. But, you know, the contribution that those technologies are going to make to food production, I think, is maybe often exaggerated. Yes, yeah.
Maybe we'll take a good question from John.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, like, I don't know about eating belts and shoes or making meat instead in vats, so I'm not sure I can comment on that. But it's just a comment on, like, on the capitalism, the colonialism. I don't think capitalism is the problem. It gets said to be a lot of the time, but capitalism is the current mode of production that characterizes the global economy and human society. And that's fairly recent. But we've been very good at, or some people have been very good at stealing things from the natural environment and appropriating the benefits for themselves. And this has been going on for a very long time. Like, yes, it happens under capitalism, but that doesn't mean if we got rid of capitalism that we'd have got rid of the problem. Because, I mean, it's a wonderful series on television, either SBS or ABC. I can't remember who it is, Stuff the British Stole.
Yeah.
Like, the British Empire was basically, you know, Britain got rich from stealing the riches from other people, from their countries, stealing their jewels, their natural resources, their food, their spices, everything. And it's hard to say that's all about capitalism. I think the problem is the greed of psychopaths. And I'm not just saying it as a throwaway line, because if we don't look at it that way, we naturalize it. And that's what we're told all the time. It's normal to be purely self-interested. It's normal to desire more rather than less. It's normal just to think about yourself and disregard the interests of anybody else and others. It's not normal. But there are enough powerful people who behave in this kind of way that we need to control them. And the organizations that they end up running also need to be controlled because they're running those organizations. I think that's the real problem.
Can we control them? Has capitalism not lifted them up into this other echelon?
Oh, if it wasn't capitalism, there'd be the elites in you know, colonial United Kingdom or the European powers. Can we control them? I mean, this is sort of edging into sort of my field, I suppose, and what I might be talking a bit more about. But we've got all sorts of global rules and we've got international organizations. And the idea is that they should be controlling these things, but instead what they're doing is promoting things like free trade. And trade is not free. Trade is controlled by Amazon, by Apple, by Nike, by these large corporations. Trade is not about free markets. It's about huge corporate control by a handful, actually about 500 or so, maybe 1,000, very large corporations. There's an opportunity to control them if we want to, that is actually easier than if it was a lot of small firms, because we can see them and we know who they are. We don't, then we've chosen not to be bothered with it, but we could be.
Yeah, this is exactly right. Like, I've heard that in Europe, the EU is a very highly sophisticated regulatory environment. And it's become so difficult now to set up and run a small or medium-sized company in many different sectors in Europe that only the large companies thrive. They have the resources to deal with all of the regulations that the EU imposes, say, on a company that, you know, is making drugs or is making food or is making cars. And any smaller company that tries to compete doesn't have those resources to meet the regulatory regulations, so they can't do it. So then you have the massive companies controlling most of the economy of Europe.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
That's actually really interesting. I'm really glad both of you mentioned that, because I've been doing some research on this myself, but like how Juliet mentioned before, like how do we balance like indigenous agriculture and capitalism? And then Eleanor just mentioned how do we get the production of like lab grown food and that? Well, from what I've seen, first of all, First of all, we already produce enough food to feed the world maybe 1.5 times over, I believe. So like this idea that we need to produce more and like we need to increase technology and we need to like subsidize corporations to feed the world. That I feel like that's kind of something that you need to examine. And there's a lot of different power, structural power, as we just mentioned in the EU, or like the discursive power of corporations to say, oh, well, actually, we need all these subsidies and we need all of this, like we can destroy the environment because we need to feed the world and food is a human right. And I would want everyone to kind of think about that because, yeah, I mean, there are other ways as we've just explored, like through indigenous agriculture or some like smallholder farms that we can get into later. But yeah, this sort of corporate capitalist model of food production isn't the only way that we can feed the world, but there are forces in the world that are kind of making it seem like it. So yeah, yeah, please.
And you go.
No, I was gonna ask John, so given there's only 500, and I love the way you've conceptualized that, the greed of psychopaths, and
Think
it's
Elon
so true.
Musk.
Sorry?
Think Elon Musk.
I think, and it is a small number, and therefore it's easier to change, and then with a view to how do you reset up the governance so that it actually is no longer 500 or 1,000, it then is, because it seems like the solutions are about sort of what multi-scale but locked rather than concentrated power. If this was small businesses, that would be a very different form of capitalism.
Yeah.
And so how does native grains get subsidized rather than processed food? Ingredients, for example.
I guess I'm more in that conspiracy mode where I feel like the powers that be and the elite capitalists are quite hand in hand. And I'm not sure how we attack that to get them to sacrifice some of what they have to create that decentralization. So there's big questions there about how that happens. I think like the three different things I want to say, like picking up on what John said, it's so fascinating. So many synergies, right? Like I teach environmental ethics, and today we were talking about it in that way where like, if you bring those macro problems back down to an interpersonal problem, if the monkey has 10 bananas and everyone around is starving and has nothing, we call that smart business. We call that good investments. We call that person a neoliberal like economic champion. We don't say, hey, that's unethical, that's psychopathic, dole it out. That's just one point. I feel like it's very interesting when you pull some of those bigger questions down and localize them because it helps you really see how wrong that is. The other one about the meats and the technological solutions. Woof, I think, technological solutions. Okay, so these are unbiased, but whatever. I think that if we go further and further down that path and as we have with technology, we haven't really thought about the ethics of technology and it slowly becomes embedded in our lives and those conveniences we then don't want to give up. We just keep piling on that type of, technological solutions. And now we look for technological solutions.
What are you talking about,
to all our big problems, right? And it's quite Promethean in its way of thinking. It's very much about human ingenuity through technology continue to overcome things. And there's a lot of arrogance in thinking that in some ways, a lot of hubris in thinking that we can just continually use technology to deal with some of these things. For example, growing meat in labs. I mean, we don't know enough about the human body to say, yes, this is going to be we don't know all the feedback effects that's going to cause. What new health problems will that cause if everyone's suddenly reliant on that? You're creating this very standardized piece of food again. Beyond that, you're disconnecting people from actually being part of nature and having to grow food and dealing with the bumpy years and the bad years and the etc. And really going to this other model that is so anthropocentric and so positioning humans at the top of that hierarchy. I worry about, yeah, where that could lead. Instead, if we use it as a technology to supplement as part of the diversity, I think that would be a better way to go. But we tend to like go, oh, that's the solution. Let's just upscale that, let's scale it out. Instead of going, okay, that can supplement there, that can supplement there. It's also supporting big businesses who can, it's centralized again. Anyway, so.
I can add on to that, like if there's time.
Yeah,
Like, I mean, like we sort of like that.
We started early, so
Yeah, sort of like, yeah, where you're going, I think. Stop me if I'm mansplaining you. Yeah, well, but but I mean, like, you know, the tendency we have is sort of like, you know, the question is to ask, like, will this fix things? You know, what is the answer? How do we have a solution? When will we have world peace? You know, that kind of thing, right? Rather than how do you look at the problem to think about other ways of dealing with it. I don't have all the answers, but if you've done one of my subjects, you'll know sometimes I trot this line out from Jeff when he was my honours supervisor, and I was doing economics at the time. I labored in politics and international relations, and here I am today. But I bought into the whole idea that you need to create markets for things because markets are efficient. So the problem with the overfishing is that the value of the resource is, well, it's undervalued. So if you actually had to pay for the right to fish, and then if you could exchange that right in a market that operated efficiently, then the value of the resource would be properly reflected and it would all be efficient. And I was sort of like arguing this with my supervisor, and he said, nah, this is the way to talk, I can't help doing accents. He said, nah, hey, John, calm down. He said, there's just too much fishing. And I said, yeah, because there aren't individual transferable quotas and there's not a market system and there's not. He said, no, there's too much fishing. There's got to be less fishing. So then you sort of go like, okay, is the lens that I'm putting on to look at this part of the problem? You know, we have to find a new grain. If we find it, it's got these properties. Now we could like grow it in mass, and then maybe some like big biotechnology company takes it over and they could produce it in a lab and they could scale it up. And we could get the shareholders to invest in it, and then we go, you know. But that's not the only solution. There's got to be other solutions.
maybe even we can, we're talking about standardization and, you know, foods that all look the same. Maybe we can go into Jeanette's research about ultra processed foods exactly. So if you want to sort of talk about what you researched on.
Yes. I do have one little point to add to the microbial agriculture, because George Monbiot talks about, well, has a whole book that looks at the different forms of agriculture and ends up being very strong on this kind of microbial protein or different forms of cellular agriculture, as long as it's somehow embedded in community. So it's like, if you had communities that owned their own, but that caused me a lot of cognitive dissonance, and I'm going, I really like you. How can you think this? So I think it's such an interesting question to explore in depth as well. So leading to ultra processed foods, I don't know. I didn't really know much about ultra processed foods until we started writing this paper, and then suddenly you realize that almost everything you eat, unless it's just there as a whole food, is probably an ultra processed food. And you start to realize, in a way, we walk into the supermarkets, and other than that, you know, you've got your agricultural, like fresh section, but all the other aisles pretty much are full of it. And we're so used to, I guess, a form of nutritional approach. We look at the ingredients. My mum was, you know, all about how much fat is in it, of course, because that was the days. Now we look at how much sugar is in it, all about this reduction to the calories, without really looking that much at the ingredients. You might look at the first two ingredients, but all of these other ingredients. I'm actually really interested in Tom's thoughts on this kind of approach and how that relates to the kind of focus on specific micronutrients, and the macronutrients. Are we balancing our carbs and our proteins? And my colleague David Rubenheimer has, with Stephen Simpson, looked a lot at the importance of protein and the way that actually we keep eating until we have had enough protein. And funnily enough, ultra processed foods tend to strip away the protein and add more salts and make us want to keep eating it, as if we're going to one day get enough protein and therefore stop eating. So ultra processed foods are defined as any food that has like an industrial ingredient, like an emulsifier or additives, nutrients, preservatives. And so it came up in about 2009, some Brazilian scientists realized that there's been this influx of obesity in Brazil, and why? And they realized that ultra processed food had really flooded the market there, because their foods before were still full of fats and all sorts of and sugars and everything, but the change had been the nature of those ingredients. So I guess the thing is sort of going from like corn, and that might be smothered in butter, but to a corn chip, and they may even have the same nutritional profile, but they're very different because those nutrients are now disembodied from their form that our bodies can perhaps digest better. So there are different aspects. So sort of there's more and more research on the rise of ultra processed foods and the way that's spread across the world. The consolidation of power within that, with ultra processed food companies also being sort of not very many companies, and then that consolidation of power then has a massive influence on influencing government, influencing the media, influencing our sort of consumer taste, and then also has a lot of control over farmers, and because they control the distribution lines in connection with supermarkets. So it sort of is spread in conjunction with each other. And the problems, the scholarship's really looking at and trying to understand what is the problem with ultra processed food. Is it the mix of ingredients, the fact that they are imbalanced in terms of their macro ingredients, high sugar, high fat? Is it those additives and are they mucking it up? Is it that they're displacing the whole food? So is it because not so much the food itself, but because we're not eating as much of the whole foods? And then is it also that they're kind of designed in such a way that entices us to eat more and more?
Yeah, kind of addictive in some way.
Yes. And
can't get enough,
yeah,
the moreish foods.
Definitely. Once you pop, you can't stop, and that shit just lures you in a whole lot of different ways. And so I think, so our research looked at this as the entanglements of systems and practices, and sort of looked at the way that often responsibility for your weight is put on the individual, and responsibility for your health, it's all about individual responsibility. Why don't we give you these guidelines, then you can follow those guidelines? And sometimes an alternative approach is to go, well, that evil processed food industry, or the evil this, or capitalism is the problem. But instead we looked at kind of how are these things entangled, and how do we start to, understand those complexities? And part of that is shifting the attention from individuals and realizing that if you're in a place, you're at university, and if the only shop that's open is selling a whole lot of imbalanced foods and processed foods, what else are you going to do? You're hungry, you have to. So how is that responsibility on you bear? And so bringing that social context, since then we've been interviewing parents, and how parents are they're supposed to be responsible for what their children eat, and yet the whole food environment is about sausages and chicken nuggets and chips, and and that's what your child wants, and the marketing of the Cocoa Pops and so it's really sort of shifting attention to what these contextual factors are and how we can shift them.
Yeah, sometimes sometimes the guidelines that we have heard over the many decades that governments have been giving us, dietary guidelines, have turned out to be pretty misleading, and they might have even been made by governments to support various industries at our expense. Like, if you look at the food pyramid that was, released as a overall guideline to people's diets in the United States in the 50s, was it, John? Anyway, something like that, many decades ago. Like, some aspects of that food pyramid, with all of the cereals in huge amounts at the bottom, and then, high protein foods in tiny amounts at the top. Not all, but some aspects of that food pyramid have been very, very deleterious to hundreds of millions of people's health in the US. And then because countries like South American countries, like you mentioned, Brazil or Australia, take on a lot of American culture, and that's the global food trade and all that kind of stuff, then we start doing the same thing. I mean, my parents were pretty obsessed with like a low-fat diet when I was growing up. And that was through government advice, I believe. And they would buy low-fat everything. I'm not kidding. Low-fat yogurt, low-fat cheese, low-fat milk. There's like everything was low-fat. And it turns out now that my understanding anyway of nutrition is that if you have protein, you should have it along with healthy fats. Like having a very low fat diet is not good for you. The total amount of calories that you eat is important. And if you have insufficient protein, you'll want to continue to eat, because we've evolved to eat up to a certain amount of protein per day, like along with many other animals. So, I mean, I recently tried to eat less bread for lunch, and instead of I have something more higher protein, you'll have some sandwiches, but because I'm starting to get a gut. These things happen, and you just can't eat too many carbohydrates without protein, because you won't feel satiated. You'll just keep on eating, and then you'll get, as you get to my age or older, you'll get type 2 diabetes, and you don't want to die like that. People who have like obesity related disorders as they're getting older, that's a really horrible way to go, believe me. So it's very important that government guidelines change with our current knowledge, and that we adapt our food systems so that we have higher protein foods, less highly processed. I mean, all food's processed. If you wash an apple, that's processing it. So don't think of processing as being bad. Almost all foods are processed, right? So even fresh foods, they're processed in some way. But it's when you, dilute nutrients or make them unavailable, or make sugars, carbohydrates too readily absorbed. So, you have massive spikes in your blood sugar, which leads to, problems in regulating that. Through insulin, you get insulin resistance. And the problem is that we all have around the same number of fat cells. When you get fatter, you don't increase the number of fat cells. Your individual fat cells get bigger. And as individual fat cells get bigger, they start behaving in silly ways. They want more and more. And, that ends up giving you insulin resistance, and what's associated with insulin resistance, and it's very, very hard to go back.
It's interesting to add one thing for the dietary guidelines. So the current Australian guidelines have changed it to a plate, but on that plate, in the section that is sort of really should be about grains and that, it's still a crumpet, which is high sugar, highly processed. And that's the Australian dietary guidelines.
Yeah, it should be a flat bread or something.
Luckily they are under review still again, but it does bring into question a lot of the things.
By the way, all you guys that look extremely healthy and slim. I'm talking more about
Me.
not you, me.
No, so just to link in though, and I know you want to wrap it up, I can see the edge of it, it's all good. But just to link in, I mean, if you think about the foods eating here and then the processing here, I actually think it goes back into production. And not just all the chemicals that we're putting on our food. Always wash your blueberries, they spray fungicide just before they pick them so they don't go moldy. Always wash your berries, okay? But if you go back into that, it's where we've modified the plants altogether. And through that modification, so they're easier to pick, or they grow to a certain size, or they have a certain color, or whatever, we have sacrificed nutrients to do that, to standardize that food. So even if it's non-processed, yes, it's better than processed, but actually if you go back to the wild corn or the wild wheat, the first wheat, the wheat that Mother Nature gave us, that's nutrient dense and tasty, but nutrient dense as in fills you up, as in you can't eat more because your body's done. And so we have sacrificed that nutrient density from the very beginning. And that's where native foods, and not just native grains, all sorts of native foods. If you think about the potential plants that exist across our planet that you could potentially eat. And they've shown that when animals eat a diversity of plants, their meat is actually more nutrient dense. So if you're only feeding animals sorghum or one type of pasture, you're also taking out the nutrient density of that food. Whereas if they eat a range of stuff, I mean, like compost, different types of grasses, different types of foods, yeah, they become this nutrient dense piece of food. So I think like we can look at it from the whole gamut of food.
I think there's some capitalism going on here. The problem is that it's not a liberal capitalism or a social democratic capitalism or whatever. It's a, as Neil Harrison and I in our book from a couple of years ago call it, it's a corporate capitalism or a corpo capitalism. Yeah. We use the word corpo capitalism because corpo is a bit corpulent, like, you know, large and slow and big, right? So a corpo capitalism for megacorps, for mega corporations. And the problem is that governments, rather than performing a regulatory role, are kind of like in bed with the big corporations. So one of the reasons why we're all eating a lot less fat was because the companies who were producing the ultra-processed foods were like, we can sell this as being healthy because we're going to pump it full of sugar and all sorts of other garbage. And then we could feel good about eating this terrible food that was low in fat. And we realized that that was all wrong. It reminds me, there's a former colleague of mine, she's now Anya Bless, Dr. Anya, she's got a PhD now. Dr. Anya Bless at the University of Technology, Sydney. She was an honours student at this university, but she went and did a PhD there instead of here. She's probably a good choice. Anyway, I remember when she was doing her honours and she was looking at meat consumption. And the CSIRO, here's an example of it. The CSIRO had done this big study on, you know, what was good to eat. And it turned out it was really good to eat a lot of meat, which is surprising because you would have thought like cutting down your meat consumption, whatever, was probably desirable, environmentally, probably good for your health as well. But the study was partially funded by the Meat and Livestock Association, which is why it turned out that, like, you know, would you believe it? Eating meat is really good for you. So this is a bit of a problem when industry gets close to research, industry gets close to government, as opposed to, like, you would think if you live in a democracy, what's the government for? The government is to represent you. Why do you bother voting otherwise? Why do you expect so little of the people who represent you? You should expect more. It goes all the way down to university. We're always told to partner with industry. We should be partnering more with industry. Why? No, we shouldn't be. And I'm not saying this is some kind of radical left-wing or whatever. It's just I'm clear-eyed about this, I think. Business exists to make money. That's why people are in business. That's what they're doing. Good luck to them. But they don't get to fund and control the research, and they don't get to make the rules. Because that leads to, well, a form of political economy and politics and society that is called all sorts of other things, which we might get to later. Yeah.
And now your government only funds this university and others to the tune of roughly 30% of what we need to run. So we're under so much pressure to get money from industry and corporations to do any research, because like you try to get money from the ARC, the Australian Research Council, for example, it's extremely competitive.
Yeah.
And then you have corporations trying to get their social and environmental, you know, their corporate social responsibility to say that, and that's like part of their funding, like they'll have a philanthropic arm, you know, the blah 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 foundation, and they'll be trying to fund all these things, but sometimes, not to threaten their business, they'll never fund something that's gonna do that.
Mm.
But it's to
It's for business.
whitewash, greenwash themselves, you know.
And I wanted to add, because Dr. Roberts, you talked about the food pyramid, and I read somewhere that that food pyramid, the reason why these different you had like a lot of grains, and you have a whole area for fats and stuff from milk, was because the research done, I think it was the FDA or something in the US, was very heavily lobbied slash the researchers were influenced or were working for the big dairy corporations and the big producers of white bread full of sugars, which shouldn't be in the whole wheats section. So yeah,
That's right.
exactly. That's just what I was thinking. And about the CSR, I think that's interesting, corporate social responsibility, because if we we go on to the next topic as well, even though we can still talk about processed food because I think everything is kind of linked, but it's true that you have companies like Coca-Cola which have this policy of doing so much corporate social responsibility about water and it's so important for people to have access to water, to have access to food. But the food or the drinks that they're providing is really, really unhealthy. And I think there was this case in Mexico City where Coca-Cola was tasked with dealing with like the water system, but they made, I can't remember the exact thing, but basically it was cheaper to buy Coke than to buy water, which is kind of crazy when you think about it.
Because every bottle of Coke takes 3 liters of water, every 1 liter.
Yeah.
Coke to make, and so transfer everything to them.
Are there any questions from the room before we continue moving on? Yeah, the question.
I do have a question. So like circling back to like the earlier topic about like biopiracy that you mentioned, I was thinking like how do free trade agreements like facilitate or like inhibit protection against biopiracy of like traditional food crops?
Well, I don't think free trade agreements even consider biopiracy. They're not looking into the company and their ethical sourcing and things like that. They're not even considering that at all. Yeah.
I'm no expert on biopiracy, but it could possibly, depending upon the free trade agreement, not the World Trade Organization, but a lot of multilateral agreements outside of that and bilateral agreements have got investor-state dispute settlement built into them, which means that if nation states, if governments aren't living up to the freeness of the trade, it allows corporations to sue governments. So I don't know any case, but it would be interesting if you want to do some research and go looking. There might be cases where corporations, I can imagine, would say, if you're stopping us from getting access to certain things that are in your, forests, in your jungle, in wherever, that actually that's an anti-free trade measure. It's an anti-competitive measure. It goes against the spirit as well as the letter of the agreement, and they could potentially sue the government. Not just not just for sort of like loss of earnings, but loss of future earnings, because there's cases of that. Recently, and I wrote about this, but I can't remember the case now. It's been a long day. In the case of Pakistan, there was a mining company. It's not food, but a mining company that wanted to exploit a resource. And after the government had done a lot of environmental investigation, they said, no, we've decided we're not going to allow you. And they successfully sued the government through the free trade agreement that they had to say that they needed compensation for loss of future earnings. So, yeah, the corporations have got a lot of power.
Well, this comes back to corporations being psychopaths, not just psychopaths being psychopaths.
They're like psychopaths.
The corporation itself, and if you've ever seen that documentary called The Corporation, because corporations have legal standing in courts, like persons, like to persons, that's it. Thing. So then this documentary tries to unpack, okay, so if they're a person, what's their personality? And they end up being the worst psychopathic, no care for human beings or ecological anything. And I think when you think about these companies and this and what psychopaths are, what do? They deceive, they gaslight, they love bomb. Think of food advertising and you'll see the psychopathicness right there. Sorry, just.
I mean, speaking of psychopaths, I actually do have a case kind of related to food of what John mentioned, and that's the reason why we have Nestle as the picture here. Nestle, they make Nesquik, they make Milo, but they're an extremely evil company. And there has been this case recently. I can't remember the country, but it's this African nation, very prone to drought, and Nestle was like siphoning water out of their reserves, and they sued the country for stopping them for taking water out of their basically like anti-drought reserves, and the argument was it wasn't even about Nestle's right to be competitive or whatever. It was literally just because if that water is there, we can't sell the water bottles back to them, which is a bit funny because it's yeah, I mean, on one hand, you could say, Nestle as a corporation and it has a certain area of land that they own and they can take water out of to fund their business. But yeah, it really makes you think about corporations these days kind of have something beyond competition. So they kind of want to rule the market rather than make this sort of like free competitive environment. And I think that we are really seeing a lot of. And yeah, I mean, Nestle, it's a processed food company as well. They wouldn't be making any money if the food wasn't processed.
They used to be called Nestles.
Nestle's.
And they
Really?
rebranded after. You can tell the
Oh,
story.
I don't know, but I remember, I don't know the story.
Oh,
I remember that.
about when they were putting cheap baby formula
Oh,
in
yeah.
Africa.
Yeah.
And then getting mothers so then stop producing
Yeah.
the baby formula thing. That's a
Yeah.
whole thing that you could unpack. Doctors were pushing it. Everyone was saying baby formula is better than breast milk. That was a whole thing there. But yeah, they were called out for it because people, women couldn't feed their babies and people died and starved, and so they rebranded to Nestle.
Yeah.
And everyone
that's-
forgot.
The baby formula thing, that's not even psychopathic behavior, I would say. That's just straight up evil because, as you mentioned, doctors, actually, there were doctors, but there were also people that were posing as doctors, but they weren't actually qualified health professionals, but they were just saying, oh, this baby formula is better than breastfeeding, buy this, and then also they put a lot of sugar in the baby formula, which was also going against regulation, and they got sued for that, and the whole thing happened, and then everyone forgot about it because that's how it happens. They rebrand, they forgot about it, and then they did it again, like maybe 20 years after, and then it's still one of the most profitable companies in the world. So,
And when you look at that, sorry,
No, go.
there's like three big of these ultra processed foods kind of big corporations. There's Nestle, Unilever, and Mars, which does like most of the chocolate stuff. But then that's kind of it, and that kind of feeds into John's classes, and that's what I'm always thinking about what John was saying, but about how you have like this sort of idea of free markets and competition, but then what you actually have is just like a sort of a 3 or 5 or a few big corporations that control, and that they're so big that they're just able to control the discourse, control the structural power, so they just control all the supply chains, and that also plays in, and because they have so much control, they have influence over governments, they can advertise to consumers, and they have discursive power over what you want, when you want it. And yeah, that's kind of scary, I think, for a lot of us. Yeah. So I don't know if there's someone that.
I just wanted to say, sorry.
No, go.
No, just a small thing, just related to Nestle, because we're talking about, but in terms of the way food and marketing can actually incite structural violence through other means. So you would have seen Nestle, it's Nestle, right? Yeah, I think so. But the racism that was embedded in the names of some of their products. So there's subliminal messaging through all of that as well. And I think when we're talking about Indigenous foods, it's really interesting to see the ways that racism has been purported by these new companies as well.
Corporate social responsibility. It's what's a good academic term for it? It's problematic. On the one hand, positively, like corporations embracing it set up expectations in society that they're going to be doing the right thing. And then if you expect them to do the right thing when they don't, their reputation takes a really big hit.
Right.
And so it's a form of governance. But then when you think about it as a form of governance, what's the reason for it? Why are they setting up those expectations? Why do they want you to feel warm feelings about their highly processed food that's going to kill you when you're older? And the reason why they're doing it is because they're wanting to get government out of the way. Because they say, look, we're already self-regulating, we're already doing the right thing, so we don't need to be regulated.
Supporting us.
And the public supporting us because look, we're doing good things. But if what is motivating the corporation is not doing good things, Nestle doesn't exist in order to solve the problems of the world. Nestle exists in order to make a lot of money. How much money? As much as possible to pay the shareholders, to pay them dividends. And unless there's some way of regulating the way in which they do that, then this sort of like corporate social responsibility is the first step to sort of governance, to self-governance, is also the first step to having private authority, which leads to the capacity for private governance instead of public governance. And then leading on from that, if you've got the right to legitimately claim to be governing and governing in society's interests, this leads to corporate sovereignty. So it leads to corporations being perceived as analogous to a state or to some kind of public authority or regulatory agency. And that's very, very dangerous, because if that is what corporate social responsibility is about, and I think it is, what is at stake is nothing less than democracy. So that's why I'm really worried about it. Anyone who embraces that as part of the solution, spoilers, in the last week of Government, Business and Society, one of the things I'm going to go with is Stephen Wilkes says, the problem is that corporate power is accommodated all the time, and this is part of it. It should be challenged.
Right.
And it should be challenged by democratically elected governments. That's what they're there for, to regulate. This is part of like ensuring that they can't do it. As an aside, Neil Harris and I, when we were writing our book, he's a great friend, we've done a lot of research together over the years. There was a report that came out, and I start the subject with it now in the first week or second week, the Business Roundtable, which is a bunch of American CEOs, and they're mostly men. They're people like Jeff Bezos, the leader also JP Morgan, CEO, all these sort of like corporate leaders, very powerful American men. And in 2018, I think it was, they came out with this statement saying they no longer thought that the main function of business is just to make profits. It's actually sort of now to look after stakeholders and govern responsibly in respect of society. And a lot of the business press and a lot of people say, this is great. This is such a good step in the right direction. And Neil and I were having this, and I've talked about it in tutorials. Neil and I were having this Skype call at the time. Remember Skype before Zoom? It doesn't exist anymore. Now called Teams, and that's awful as well. But anyway, we were having this Skype call, and he said, and what he said, I'm quoting, I don't like swearing, but he said, you know, who are these bastards, you know, who are going to govern me? And I said, who are they, Neil? I said, they're a bunch of rich, white American men, mate. And I said, they're not just going to be governing you in America, they want to govern me in Australia. You know, what gives them the right to do this? That's the danger. That's what the CSR is for, I think. That's what worries me about it. If they say they're going to fix all the problems, you know, you've got to remember that that's not why they're in existence. That's not what the corporations are for.
Well, what do we have to know? And I mean, the people can see that the cost of living is going up, and the groceries are going up, and income to buy a house.
Yeah.
I mean, people realize what's happening.
At last.
Affects them, yeah, at last. And
yeah.
I hope it's not. I don't think it's too late.
And look, and what's hopeful about that, so it should be positive, right? What's hopeful about that is in the case of Australia, because of our electoral system, when people realise that, and they realise that it doesn't change when you vote for the major parties, we're going to get very political because we've got an election this weekend, right? What we've seen is like more and more independents getting voted in. And that's actually putting the major parties on notice. If you don't have an electoral system that does that, you open up the possibility for a Donald Trump. If you've got a first past the post system, that kind of thing, that's the danger. You've got to find a way. Oh, gee, I'm doing government. I'm doing my subject, actually. Sorry. I'm doing like a shortened version of it. If you don't have a way of reconciling what capitalism does with public welfare, eventually history tells us, there's many studies that show this, you end up getting a revolution or some kind of collapse. And I think we're seeing a bit of that going on at the moment.
Yeah.
There needs to be a sort of like a public welfare function for the state in moderating the downsides as well as benefits of
why are
capitalism.
companies public anymore? Why are most companies private? Why is most government, why is like most like social functions private?
It's a good question. I mean, like they're called publicly listed companies, which is confusing
Well, it's not really.
because they've got shareholders, so they're publicly listed, as opposed to privately owned companies, which is what Adam Smith and the classical political economists were writing about, where there's an entrepreneur with skin in the game who builds a factory and employs people. The problem is like the responsibility is unclear. Like shareholders are supposed to be the owners of the company, but they're not. Shareholders own shares. They don't quite own the company. And the board's responsible to them, but it's not quite responsible enough because when they do a whole lot of damage, oh, they leave in disgrace with millions of dollars in payouts, you know, this kind of thing, but nobody goes to jail. The rules of corporate governance need to be rewritten to give corporations, if they're really going to have public responsibilities, they need to be regulated as such. But at the moment, they're not. And then instead, what they're doing is they're going with corporate social responsibility.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, they're not even really publicly, they are technically publicly owned, but publicly listed. They're not really owned because how many of us own stocks, right?
Exactly.
And how many of us own a fair share of the company?
And yet the problem is we all do. So here's the politics of it too. Because we are all dependent on these corporations for our superannuation, politically, we don't want them to fail or to get too badly damaged. Yeah. And it's why we're worried about Donald Trump, not because he's an evil lunatic, but because he's damaging the share market, which means my superannuation, Mike was talking about it before we started, has gone down by about 5%.
Yeah.
And we're all checking it. So even if I was like a radical Marxist or something, I'd be going like, oh, gee, I don't want the stock prices to go down because I'd like to retire in the next 5 years. And so this gives them some freedom too.
John Howard said the other day, no one in the entire time I was a politician, even Prime Minister, ever came up to me complaining about the increased value of my house.
Yeah.
It's
So that's the problem.
I was thinking the other day, it was like, people don't respond negatively when their house prices go up, but their wages stay the same. They respond negatively when their wages go down, but their house prices.
Yeah.
And in reality, it's the same thing happening. It's just
Interesting.
different optics.
One's about wealth and one's about earnings.
We'll go back to food,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yes,
Sorry, can we run something for a
Yeah,
second? So how many of you grow any food at all, even if it's just herbs in a small garden or a pot or something? Put up your hand if you grow anything. And does anyone want to volunteer like how much satisfaction they get out of that? I mean, when you're eating it, like what's a good example? Like, because I don't know about you, because I live in this, it's almost like a terrace house. It is actually separated, but the whole land area of my house is 186 square meters, I think. And so we don't have any yards. So I've got these two like cylinders like this with soil, plastic with soil down the bottom, and I'll grow some herbs or spinach or whatever in them. And just taking those spinach leaves and making a salad out of it, it's just so satisfying compared to buying exactly the same product or very similar, at a supermarket. So, I mean, don't want to sound like your dad or something, but if you're not doing it, try to grow something. Like it is very, very satisfying. And to have food that it literally is not processed. You can just take your basil leaves straight from the garden. It's been washed by the rain, okay, guys? You can eat it. There's something very nurturing, nourishing about doing that. So just try it if you haven't done it before. Yeah.
Would any of the panelists ever consider like a 3-month stint in the wild? Like Bear Grylls type?
No.
Only if I had an Aboriginal person with me who knew what they were talking about, otherwise I would die.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's unless you have someone who knows their stuff, you're gonna.
Okay, so this is a step on from like, yeah, all right, you grow your own veg or whatever, you jump out of a helicopter into the water and you pull yourself out on the land, and the first beast you find, you like, kill it, eat it. Okay, before we get to that stage, though, if we're talking about, okay, back to ultra processed foods, yeah, they're expensive. Yeah, you've been told that they're good for you and everything, and there's the social responsibility, and you've got more advice so you can make an informed decision and this kind of thing. It's all such a snow job, right? I'm going to sound like someone's dad here. I've said this to my kids. It's like, here's an example. Recently, like what, about 4 or 5 days ago, I bought 2 steaks and they cost $15 each. So they were good steaks, you know, not cheap ones. $30 worth of steak. My God, that's expensive. I must be very well off. I live in the eastern suburbs as well, so maybe I am, right? But we got 4 meals out of those steaks because we had dinner. We had half each, my wife and I. We're now empty nesters. And then the next night, chopped up another half and make them into sort of potato patties and whatever, fry them and have them with salad, yum. And then like the other one, like it got on a sandwich, or maybe not quite 4 meals or 3, but you see what I mean? Like that's much cheaper than say going to McDonald's. I can't believe how often people eat McDonald's. It costs a fortune.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly bad for you. So this is the other thing, like, you know, like we're all getting sort of, we're getting snowed. We're getting sort of like there's this mirage of, you know, health and stories and, you know, fairy tales we're being told.
I think something really cool to have would be like community chicken coops, you know, like eggs and that source of protein. And so my parents get, like, they live in the country, so, you know, you live in the country, you just have access to, everyone just swaps food. I've got too many zucchinis. Oh yeah, I got too many eggs.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of swapping. And sometimes those eggs, like, amazingly diverse, but you guys know, like, they just taste so much better.
Yeah.
There's something about the taste as well that comes with growing your own food and having that diverse. I mean, the eggs, sometimes there's 2 yolks, sorry, 2 yolks, etc. Like, I don't know, you're just getting that diversity again.
There's a council in Melbourne that started to give people egg-laying chickens because people needed more protein, and you know, eggs are a pretty efficient way to do that, especially if they've got a yard where the chickens can go around and just, you know, eat food scraps or whatever. And then this was so successful that now there's this whole range of different councils all throughout the Melbourne area that are doing this, and thousands of people are getting these chickens for free.
My area started.
Wait, are they dead chickens or are they alive chickens?
I love chickens.
Yeah.
The council is giving people alive chickens.
Yeah, like
They
chickens.
started doing it in my area. They didn't have a lot of followers.
If you've got a bit of a yard and like, and
Oh, yeah,
you haven't
yeah.
raised chickens before, just get 2 of them, and it's amazing. The eggs, like, that's another satisfying thing.
And the taste, I mean, like on eggs, like, I don't know, has anyone been to America and eaten eggs there? Yeah, it's a strange experience, I found, because like, they have a lot of way of cooking eggs, you know, over easy, upside, you know, all this kind of thing, whatever. No one cooks eggs like Americans. They do terrific eggs, and they're all absolutely tasteless. It's fascinating because it's all factory produced. Yeah.
I think this all kind of leads to our final little theme, which is climate change and the environment and food. And, you know, often we kind of talk about how the importance of locally grown food, locally sourced food, as a way to fight climate change in our everyday lives. I don't know if any of you have things to say about that, or
Yeah, food miles are important, definitely. So we're very lucky in Australia because we can produce, or we do produce, about 92% of the total value of our food that we eat. So we only import about 8%. A lot of countries aren't like that. I mean, if you're living in Singapore, you can't possibly produce all your own food. It's just impossible. So you have to import it. But when I see in the supermarket a fruit or vegetable that's not in season in Australia and it has to be sent from California or even further away, I tend to go, no, I don't want to, that's too bad, you know. And when I hear about, well, so every year I take 20 PhD students on an agricultural excursion somewhere in New South Wales for 3 days. And well, an example farm that we went to a couple of years ago was in Young. It was a cherry farm. And really all of the cherries that they grow there are high grade, so they just throw away all the rest of them pretty much. They get very little money for them. So they're all the A-grade cherries. They are flown to China. And I know another company, my PhD student runs this company now, grows cherries in Chile, they get flown to China. So the food miles there is kind of mind-bogglingly bad, right? Like it's just the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of strawberry is just horrendous. So I think food miles is pretty important. You were saying more about.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I mean, the interesting thing about living in Australia is that in that regard, it's not the typical experience from a lot of the rest of the world.
Yeah.
We lived in the UK for about a year, and it was bizarre. When you went to, well, it's not bizarre, it's how it is there. You go to Sainsbury's or Tesco's and you go to the fruit and veg section, there's mangoes all year round. There's peaches all year round.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Nothing goes in and out of season. Whereas if you're Australian, you get used to like, oh, I've seen the first mango, and it costs $10, you know, wait another 5 or 6 weeks and they'll come down in price and we'll start buying them. And they come in and then they go away. And I think we've got to get a little bit more like that rather than, as you say, the food miles. Having said that, I mean, on the flip side of that, in the case of countries like the UK, I mean, the weather's awful. And you know, there's a reason why at Christmas they're eating like treats like Christmas cakes and puddings, which are also awful, horrible desserts. Because that was a treat, you know, back in the day, that was the best you could come up with in the middle of winter.
Stores well.
Yeah, that, like dried fruits and that kind of thing. So, okay, I understand that there's a demand for, you know, from Chinese people who want to eat cherries, you know, from
Oh yeah, I can understand the demand.
yeah. But you know, it's a problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
Have you heard of Erewhon, the LA grocery store?
No. What do they do?
So they have an $18 strawberry.
Oh yes. Oh yes, I have heard of this. Yes. So it's a company I think that specializes in perfect fruits, right? So you can spend a lot of money on individual fruits because they will be as good as they can possibly be. And people can get a bit obsessive about that.
It seems like a status thing.
Yeah, it's a status thing, I guess.
Like a pineapple.
Yeah, I think that the other thing with climate change is also sort of the different carbon emissions associated with what you're eating. And there's some really surprising things, like there's a website, Our World in Data, which has some really good graphics. So for example, your coffee and your chocolate is far worse than you would hope it was per 100 grams. And of course, different types of meat and there's those aspects. But then there's also bringing that into the context of how it's grown and the different aspects that we've kind of touched on today. But within that as well is sort of the land use aspects that is often not considered. So the more land and the more we encroach on the Amazon to then create either agricultural fields or grow animals there, the more that's got multiple impacts on the environment.
Well, now the Amazon is a net emitter, which is when I heard that a couple of years ago, it was so depressing. So it's a net emitter of carbon dioxide because of the fires. It's like there's just so many fires in the Amazon through, you know, people that let them just the land cleared. Yeah.
Wow, that's horrible.
Used to be the lungs of the.
Yeah. And so, no, I was just going to say, so there's aspects when we sort of look at the really big picture, I think, in terms of mitigating climate change and finding ways to live differently. There's aspects of injustice or inequality that we need to keep in mind, because if you live very, very frugally and you only eat on your land, you might actually and you don't have a car and you don't fly anywhere, you might actually have a lifestyle that is 1 ton or less of carbon emission. And you may even have a net zero. If you're just living on land the way you're meant to, you're part of it, you could have a net zero life. If you're, I don't know, like me, I've got a car and kids and, you know, every now and then I take a flight, I'm on a 20, 30 ton a year. And I know, you know, and the wealthier you get, you tend to spend more, travel more, consume more, have the expensive strawberry with all the miles, everything that adds up. So you might have 100 tons, and you times that by 1 million, and that becomes 100 million tons, or 1 billion, that you're suddenly in the gigatons. Collectively, we have 50 gigatons a year. And so it's quite clear what the difference that the richer or wealthier you are, the higher emissions. So the more we have to think about how we rethink the miles, the way we grow, the way we eat, and the whole.
Question over there.
Yeah, just a minor question. I don't want to be the devil's advocate or some sort of blanket, but I feel like a lot of this importing foods from God knows where is kind of a necessity for a lot of developing countries. I know if we have massive emerging food markets such as China, with a growing middle class, perhaps still growing now, and at least culturally speaking, a lot of Chinese families will prize the consumption of meats. Perhaps due to some sort of historical trauma from famines or anything like that, but in any case, this does create a massive amount of demand for very basic foodstuffs such as pork or chicken or beef. And if I recall, Chinese Department of Agriculture did say that they can't sustain their country and self-sufficiency over, I think it was 10 years ago. I'm not sure if that still holds nowadays, but in any case, they're forced to import a lot of these foods. And I'm just wondering whether or not, this consideration that we have to be more sustainable with our consumption is a sacrifice that a lot of these developed countries, not just China, perhaps also India, Indonesia, massive populations with food scarcity issues, and perhaps in the present, might need to import regardless of they're making a net zero impact.
Well, Australia produces so much wheat and other grains that we feed roughly 60 million people outside of Australia. We have a population of 27 million, and yet we feed, double or more of that outside because we have this tremendous, tremendously efficient agriculture, large farms, large machines, good export mechanism. So, I would never say, Indonesians, stop importing our wheat. And it's not just because, I want to see Australian farmers do well. It's because, I don't think Indonesia can make enough wheat to satisfy its population requirements. So I have to import it. I totally agree with you.
I'm just concerned that, I'm not accusing everyone, but I'm just concerned that perhaps sometimes this sort of discussion, like with some sort of unjustified using assumption that, now we can produce so much food that somehow these growing menaces in the international market might change.
I've been writing a chapter at the moment for the next book, thinking about these kinds of things. And the problem is having a static rather than a dynamic conception of the problem. By which I mean, the problem is not that Chinese people are eating, the problem is not the cherries, right? The problem is how they're getting there. And if they keep on going there in the same way, like the grains or whatever, then we've got a climate change problem. But I remember reading a few years ago, there was a forecast by the European Commission, European Union, that basically if shipping, as it currently stands, kept on growing, trade kept on growing, that shipping would account for more greenhouse gas emissions than any country in the world. Well, once you know that that's a problem, then there's a problem with the shipping. So it's like, what are they burning? Do they need to be burning fuels? That kind of thing. It's a little bit like the idea that to address climate change, it's all about the choices that we as individuals need to make and also collectively need to make. That's a political act to sort of shift responsibility onto you. Whereas in reality, what that means is that the energy, for example, is still being generated by burning gas or coal. So whereas like if you change the way the energy is generated, if you change the way in which the trade is done, this takes me to areas like I'm not an engineer or whatever, right? But the problem is not the cherries or the grains or whatever. Well, it might be in the way in which they're produced, but the problem is how they're getting there. And that's maybe something that should be debated a bit more.
And just to add on to that, actually, and I think John will agree with me as well. But yeah, it's the way that they're getting there. But it's
They
also
can't go by train, you know, to China.
yeah. Well, the thing is, this is a capitalist system,
Sure.
and to me, it feels like it's not really about how they get there or who consumes it, but it's the externalities that are created when you trade this way. Julia, you mentioned like carbon reduction flights and stuff. Like if corporations just simply paid for the price of carbon recapture when they ship that, I think that would be pretty fair. But in like this sort of capitalism, and I don't want to get too Marxist, but I should. Well, actually, there's a very good book. There's a very good book called Foodie's Guide to Capitalism, which is kind of like a political economy book, but they're kind of Marxist or like classical liberal in perspective. That's a very fascinating book. If you guys all follow the Instagram, I'll probably share it there. I've actually even talked to the we've actually talked to it's Eric Holt 2 minutes. Yeah, he's retired now, but we've spoken to him and he did give us the permission to share that. But that's a very fascinating book, and yeah, I think like if the corporations just paid their tax, if they just paid the carbon fee price, then yeah.
Can I jump in? Because carbon credits are massively flawed. So that's part of the CSR. Look, we're offset net zero. That is brainwashing language. That is making it a calculation when it is not. I'll come back. But just to go through 3 things that just what I was listening to around developing countries can't be self-sufficient. I think it is the exploitation of developed countries and corporations that is generating that. So I've worked in Cambodia on some rice projects, and I was meant to be there for one role, but my role became about advocating for smallholders to not join mass production, mass exports, and instead, what about self-sufficiency and local self-sufficiencies? And when we think about self-sufficiency, it depends on what paradigm you're thinking about that through. If it's current ways of producing, sure. But if we can have food-rich environments, nutrient-dense food, you start to think very differently about how much food is needed and how much land do you need to grow it. And if you could mix it up with some, like skyscraper greenhouses and lab-grown meat, if you could mix that up, actually, do you need to have so much food generating food miles around? That's one thing. The other part of this is around food waste. I think food miles and then food waste is just massive. And if you read localized food, actually, you could start to deal with some of those inefficiencies. If you started to not just localize, through community supported agriculture relationships between consumers and producers, but if we started to look more at community-led preserving and other things to eat, seasonally, all those sort of things, if you could relocalize in that way, actually, it's a different paradigm for food altogether, rather than going, what do we do in our current paradigm? Because every solution just leads to another problem. Because you're still working in the same, what's that Einstein quote? What's that? You can't dismantle with the master's tools, whatever. All those quotes speak to that. If you keep staying in that mindset, you can't get there. And I think that that's for me where native grains, and I know that I'm going on about it, but grasses are the staple of what we eat. If you eat rice, if you eat wheat, this is the staple. A lot of our temperate landscapes were grasslands. we've got to come back to grasses and understanding where grasses have evolved for hundreds of thousands of years, the types of adaptive mechanisms that are in there, the types of resilience that those grasses have, their evolution mechanisms. It's amazing. So unprecedented climate change, native grasses, like that's that's where there's going to be a future. And if we think about native grasses in Australia, okay, so I'm not saying that all agriculture needs to go to native grasses. I'm just saying we need to diversify and mix it up a bit more and have a more patchy landscape of different types of crops, you know, maybe the crops that we eat today, like wheat, but then native grassland. You need that diversity in the landscape. Native grasses both help us adapt to climate change, create biodiversity naturally, have super long roots. They tap into groundwater. They don't worry too much about drought. They're adapted. You don't need to use pesticides. You don't need to use fertilizers. They're adapted to these soils. So you're taking out all these negative externalities. On top of that, they're generating soil microbial health. So you have really lots and lots of microbial activity. When those microbes die, they're carbon. So you are mitigating climate change at the same time as adapting to climate change, at the same time as addressing ecological questions of justice, at the same time as addressing social questions of justice. That's why I come back to the grasses, because it is that virtuous win-win-win-win-win cycle.
We've come full circle then. That's it.
Thanks so much for getting us on such a positive and concrete solution, because it was getting a little bleak and it was getting a little dystopian. But
yeah.
But maybe,
should we have a last word? Maybe does anyone have any burning questions? Any?
But I don't agree. And yeah, well, you went back to this, but I feel like by saying that developing countries are dependent on importation from already developed countries, it kind of reinforces, well, this whole idea of like these countries that are already like up there are helping these countries and they need this from those places, when the ones that are truly benefiting from this are those countries that are like controlling everything. Yeah. And I was watching this documentary on Niger, and they're actually they have this huge project going on where they're rebuilding across hundreds of kilometers like wetland and like grass, and just trying to like, you know, bring back like more agriculture in the country. And the leaders were saying, like in the documentary, that they don't need rich countries to come there and give them food, give them like those resources, because that won't truly help them. It's just going to feed like more dependency and more like power relations between those nations. And what they need is to see like what's on their land, how they can use their land and change certain methods and adapt to new situations, to like grow their own food, use their own methods, traditional methods to feed their people, instead of like relying on like developed countries who are benefiting from this.
To figure out, let's say, a new way to grow crops sustainably, this is usually new knowledge, new technology. And new knowledge and new technology usually does come from developed countries, to foreign direct investment, to scientists, and so on. So the first thing I think that needs to be addressed is the local education system. Somehow they have to educate their own scientists, their own people, that will give them the new knowledge and develop the new technology needed for the country too. Because until and unless they have that, they're going to be stuck in that cycle of dependence on developed countries, on American or whatever scientists, American technology, and so on.
Yeah, great. Well, you can continue that inter-Marxist debate on your own time. I think we have like some like world systems series of like fully automated luxury communism type of thing. But we would really appreciate if you guys would give us your feedback through here. Just scan the QR code. We'll have that open. And panelists, do you have anything to advertise, or any units that you think are really cool? Anything to share?
Your last,
Can we say some last words?
yeah, please.
I really think that we really need to focus on integrating conservation and production. And part of that is accepting what Mother Nature does and what Mother Nature can do and where we can be stewards and help that along rather than trying to control and create. I take your point about scientists and the need for that's still through a certain paradigm though, right? And I think this is where it becomes really interesting in terms of technology. I'm not anti-technology, I use technology, I rely on it. But, and I think there's some really great work that's been done by some philosophers, and I can't think of it now. But when we think about Prometheanism, right? Prometheus, and there's a whole mythology around that. But basically, it's about foresight. And it's all about future thinking and what do we do in the future? And that's very techno-focused in some ways. And his brother, Epithemius, is hardly ever heard about. And his is hindsight. And looking back and looking at what we can learn from our mistakes. But Epithemius was seen as lazy and Prometheus was seen as the hero. And we seem to have this sort of, it's like a very linear vision of civilization that once we had no technology, now we have technology and have improved. Whereas we've created this whole new suite of problems. So sometimes looking back may be where we can start to create more of a patchwork in what we do. And that's where looking back is like Indigenous knowledges, other ways of living, alternative ways of being, alternative ways of having economies based on giving rather than taking. There's so much that we could do if we started looking at the whole Prometheus and Epithemius at the same time.
That's what we really like to emphasize in Sydney Uni Gastrodiplomacy. Yeah, please.
I'll just finish with like, it's important not to get depressed and to be positive. My favorite author is, as you've heard me say, is Ursula Le Guin, not an academic, but a writer of science fiction. She wrote The Left Hand of Darkness, The Lane of Heaven, The Dispossessed, Matter of Segre, many other really good pieces of really what is feminist and speculative fiction, and terrific writer. She was also a political essayist. She died a few years ago. In one of the introductions to one of the issues of The Left Hand of Darkness, she says, if you look at the way that things are at the moment and project forward, it always ends in you dying of cancer or the death of the biosphere or something like that. But the thing is that things change. So when we're looking at solutions from where we stand at the present, we're good at like identifying what the technologies and the problems are. But the thing is like events happen and things change. We're on a particular trajectory that got us here. It's possible to think of alternatives to get you to other places, looking back as well as looking forward too.
Yeah. And I'd add to that as well, that if we can think about a vision of the future that we actually would like, and then work backwards. So we're very good at going with our dystopias, with all the things that are going on in the world. But why don't we start with a vision of where we want, what our society, and I feel like we really touch on that. Maybe we can figure out, well, what is the role of AI within that vision? We might not have a role. What is the role of food? Like, what does it look like? If we don't have an image of the future that actually excites us, how are we ever going to get there?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to you guys for organising it. Like, and the world needs more people who think in a food systems way, and you guys being here shows me that you're all like,
So the conversation is definitely not over, but we just all go outside. We'll have a lot of great food, and you so we'll also have all these QR codes for the feedback for those who haven't had the ones that were on screen, and for those who are not following our Instagram account, we have events coming up. Please follow us and come to our other events. That would be great. Thank you. Good.